First and foremost, I just want to give a huge thanks to Corey for the numerous generous donations that he's made through the From Nothing official website. I don't know who he is, but his support has been invaluable to my goals and dreams of this community. Again, thank you so much. Greetings, denizens of the Empire. It's Jabara here. In a period spanning from the 16th century onwards, many European nations became absolutely obsessed with the idea of conquering the world, most notably the conquest of the Americas, and later, virtually the entire world was under European control, either directly or indirectly. However, a surprisingly little known fact is that Africa was colonized relatively late within this period of European imperialism, and relatively recently in world history as a whole. Why is that? Well, today, I will present to you but a few, but quite possibly the most significant reasons why that is the case. Those who are less well versed in world history tend to think that Africa and the Americas shared a similar history. You know, the typical narrative: a bunch of white men showed up on boats one day centuries ago and conquered primitive peoples with their advanced technology like firearms, metal weapons, all the while indirectly decimating their populations with germs. While this is partially true in some cases, it's an oversimplification, or just utterly incorrect in many cases. The first reason isn't really a reason, it's just a perpetuated historical inaccuracy. Conquest of the Americas and Africa wasn't as easy as the books or descriptions make it out to be. Despite the technological advantages of Europeans, it took them several years to conquer the Aztec and Inca, which were the Americas' most powerful civilizations at the time of arrival. And even after they were conquered, a firm political and military hold on these civilizations by the Spanish was still loose due to heavy resistance from the indigenous people. The Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula took nearly 200 years to be fully subjugated by the Spanish, and the Seminoles of Florida were never officially conquered at any point. Instead of being removed to the west as with most other Native American people, they resisted conquest by seeking refuge in the swamps of Florida for over a century before finally being recognized by the US government as an independent sovereign, the Seminole tribe of Florida. In fact, to this day, a simple Google search of unconquered people will yield results almost exclusively consisting of information about the Seminoles. For most of Africa's history, the case was quite similar to the Seminoles, but this resistance to colonization was more widespread than in the Americas. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the African continent remained completely independent of any external rule until the late 1800s. It wasn't until the Scramble for Africa, a period spanning from 1881 to 1914, that the African continent collectively and rapidly began to be colonized by European nations. This time period also coincided with the colonization of most of the Asian continent at the same time. Even places like Japan and China were virtually bullied into what Western powers wanted without being directly colonized, such as the case with the Opium Wars or the Black Ships of Japan. So again, that begs the question: what took Europeans so long to colonize or bully Africa and Asia into submission in comparison to their Native American counterparts? Well, first, I just want to briefly shout out Happy Hippo Herbals for making this video possible. Happy Hippo Herbals is a provider of numerous alternative medicine products, some of which I use regularly to help me stay focused and feel less anxious in my daily life. You can receive not a 15%, but now a 20% discount on all Happy Hippo Herbals products using my promo code FN10. Go to fromnothing.info/market for a direct link to their website and other brands that I've worked with in the past. One reason why Africa was colonized so much later than the Americas is one of the most profound: disease. Unlike the case in the Americas, Africans didn't face massive epidemics of imported foreign diseases. Smallpox and influenza, among other illnesses, devastated Native American populations, indirectly assisting European colonial ambitions. In fact, much of the Inca Empire as well as its ruler, Huayna Capac, had already succumbed to a smallpox epidemic which preceded any actual European military engagement or contact, possibly arriving through a network of scouts. These same diseases that wreaked so much devastation on Native American populations were already present in Africa, long before European ships began arriving on their shores. Due to geographical proximity, these diseases, usually inaccurately dubbed as European diseases, were actually shared throughout Africa, Asia, and Europe, and a more accurate classification of them would be Old World diseases or Afro-Eurasian diseases. Many of these illnesses originated in livestock, including cattle, goats, sheep, and chickens, all of which were present on all three continents of the Old World, but absent in the Americas. And over time, their diseases mutated into strains that had the ability to infect humans. Subsequently, natural resistance to these diseases developed from generation to generation over the millennia. Trade, warfare, and migration throughout Africa and Eurasia ensured that these diseases continued to flow through the various populations and their respective gene pools, effectively allowing the respective populations to build up antibodies and stronger levels of immunity and pass these same genes on to their kin. While diseases like smallpox were and still are potentially deadly to all human beings, the sheer scale and rate of mortality was higher in the Americas due to the lack of genetic resistance. For example, it is estimated that up to 90% of the original Native American population succumbed to Old World diseases, smallpox being the primary culprit. To present day, many of the inhabitants of the Americas are of European or African descent, and many of the Native American populations that still exist are heavily mixed with the latter two. By contrast, when smallpox epidemics would hit Europe, the average death rate was only around 25 to 30%. While I was unable to find any exact statistics for death rates among Africans in pre-colonial times, it is fair to assume that the death rate was equal, if not similar to that of Europe, or possibly even lower. This is evident in the fact that most of Africa's indigenous population still makes up the majority, even after mass displacement of peoples during the transatlantic slave trade and numerous colonial atrocities, like the tragic loss of potentially up to 15 million human lives in the Congo Free State. Smallpox was well known in West Africa and a frequent theme in many African cultures, including their religious pantheons, with one example being Shapona, the Yoruba god of smallpox. Additionally, Africans are even credited with teaching the practice of smallpox inoculation to the American colonies. A slave by the name of Wenzemis, believed to be of Akan ancestry, taught Cotton Mather, his master, a medical procedure that grants lifelong immunity to smallpox. Something he claimed was regularly practiced by his people back in what is now modern-day Ghana. If you'd like to know more about this process, I'll leave a link to it at the end screen. In addition to diseases that Africans shared with Europeans and their local medical practices to resist them, Africans also hosted their own plethora of diseases such as yellow fever, malaria, and the sleeping sickness, all collectively known as tropical diseases. In fact, early explorers in the region dubbed West Africa as the white man's grave, primarily due to the endemic diseases which they lacked natural immunity to. Basically, the reverse of what was happening in the Americas was happening to Europeans when they ventured into Africa. In fact, in the 18th century, for every 1,000 European newcomers to the West African coast, anywhere between 80 and 700 would die, much higher mortality rates than in other regions of the world with similar climates to West Africa, like those found in Asia and South America. Sickle cell anemia, most common in Africa, grants virtual immunity to malaria, and I myself have a different gene, most common in people of African descent called G6PD, that also grants resistance to malaria. In addition to diseases, Africans had another advantage over their Native American counterparts: iron and horses. The latter didn't exist in the southern half of the continent and simply could not exist in the heavily forested regions, due to the aforementioned sleeping sickness which was transmitted by a vector insect known as the tsetse fly. Horses did exist, however, as far south as the grasslands of West Africa, and in great numbers. The Oyo Empire, a large Yoruba polity located in what are now Nigeria and Benin between 1300 and 1896, was renowned for its large cavalry. Numerous neighboring states also shared this tradition of cavalry. The Mali and Songhai empires of West Africa both possessed formidable cavalry forces as well, and early Islamic texts describing the Ghana Empire, West Africa's oldest known empire, frequently mentioned the use of horses. Even states like the Ashanti Empire and the Dahomey Kingdom that didn't directly employ horses in their armies still at the very least had knowledge of their existence and experience fighting against armies from the north that used them, something that Native American civilizations lacked. In comparison to their stone counterparts, iron tools and weapons are stronger and more durable. Stone and obsidian weapons, for example, are prone to chipping beyond repair upon impact against a hard object. For example, a conquistador's steel chestplate, something that would never happen with iron weapons unless they were just improperly forged. Additionally, iron can be forged into a wider variety of objects and molded into very specific shapes and sizes customized for highly specialized purposes. It can also be sharpened, repaired, and even reforged into an entirely different item if needed. While the functionality of analogous iron tools and weapons don't offer a massive advantage over their stone counterparts during utilitarian use in the majority of cases, there are some industries that Native American people simply could not compete with due solely to the lack of iron smelting infrastructure. For example, numerous African kingdoms locally manufactured their own firearms solely from acquiring models from Europeans for the purpose of replication. The kingdoms of Benin, Wassoulou, and Bornu are but a few examples of this. By contrast, no such infrastructure existed in the Americas. No corps of iron blacksmiths had existed for millennia, as was the case in Africa. The Inca and surrounding peoples were the only New World civilizations with an already existing tradition of smelting, as in the practice of depositing ores into a furnace and forging them into metal and ultimately utilitarian items. However, these were bronze alloys which were produced by a process significantly different and arguably more simple than that needed to smelt iron and steel. A highly complex process that required Bronze Age people of the Old World 2,000 years to learn, and even longer for it to be at a quality that surpassed bronze. For much of the Iron Age, common iron tools were used despite their inferiority to bronze, solely because they were cheaper, and in all parts of the world, having large quantities of bronze tools and weapons was something that only the wealthy could afford. By contrast, iron is much more common, and thus iron tools and weapons were readily available in all tiers of society at lower prices. And the last major reason why I think that Africa was relatively resilient to colonization was the simple fact that the continent consisted of more states and kingdoms than the Americas as a whole. Contrary to popular belief, when Europeans first began direct trade with sub-Saharan Africa in the 15th century, they already found themselves immersed into lands of numerous kingdoms and civilizations, already in existence, with their own political systems, armies, and trade networks. Early Portuguese explorers failed to appreciate this fact, attempting to establish influence along the Gambia and Senegal river systems by force, only to be met by fierce and coordinated resistance from various kingdoms, who by all accounts enforced their boundaries and customs in an organized manner. The kingdoms of Niumi and Jagra are but a couple examples of this, as the Portuguese suffered military defeats at their hands when attempting to establish dominion in their waterways during the 1400s. This forced the Portuguese and other European visitors to sue for more diplomatic approaches in all future encounters with other states of Africa as well, a fact that remained true up until the Scramble of Africa in the 19th century. And by the 19th century, numerous developments and innovations finally allowed Europe to virtually muscle through any and everyone who stood in their way. The discovery of quinine's anti-malarial properties allowed Europeans to operate in West Africa without the risk of death by disease. Weapon innovations such as the fully automatic Gatling gun and Congreve rockets allowed for military superiority of relatively small European forces over much larger African armies. And logistic developments like steamships and telegraphs allowed for faster and more efficient troop transport and communication. All of this supercharged by a blossoming industrial revolution which allowed European powers to mass-produce weapons and equipment for full-time professional armies, government personnel, and other workers of numerous trades at a rate never seen before in history. And it was at this point, and only this point, that the narrative of white superiority finally took its toll on the African continent. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'd love to know your opinions on this subject, so don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. For sources, check out my website, linked below. If you'd like to support future projects, you can do so there as well, or by clicking the join button below, or by becoming a patron. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching as usual, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.